J.R.R. Tolkien's best friends were obliterated in the trenches of World War I. The men he called his fellowship, who promised they'd change the world together. Decades later, when he wrote the ending of The Return of the King, he broke every fantasy rule and wrote the truth about surviving when your brothers don't. And it's why the ending still destroys everyone who reads it. In 1937, Tolkien had published The Hobbit. It was an immediate success, charming readers with its tale of a comfortable hobbit thrust into an unexpected adventure. His publisher, Stanley Unwin, wanted more. Specifically, he wanted a sequel. What Unwin expected was another light-hearted children's book. What he got instead was something far more ambitious, far more complex, and far more agonizing to complete. Tolkien began writing The Lord of the Rings almost immediately after The Hobbit's publication, but the years stretched on with no end in sight. 1940 became 1945. 1945 became 1950. The manuscript grew longer, denser, more intricate. Tolkien couldn't stop revising. He couldn't stop perfecting. The problem wasn't a lack of material. Tolkien had written thousands upon thousands of pages. He had created genealogies stretching back thousands of years. He had invented languages complete with their own grammar and poetry. He had drawn maps, composed songs, written appendices longer than most novels. The problem was that Tolkien couldn't let go. Every chapter demanded another revision. Every name required another layer of authenticity. His perfectionism, which made his world so rich and real, had become a prison. Sound familiar? How many of us have projects sitting unfinished because they're never quite perfect enough? Creative works trapped on hard drives, in notebooks, in our heads, because we're terrified that what we release won't match the vision inside. Tolkien's 17-year struggle isn't just literary history. Every artist's nightmare. The programmer who never launches the app. The writer who never finishes the novel. The musician who never releases the album. And what Tolkien learned about finishing, despite that fear, might be the most important part of this story. Stanley Unwin's letters grew increasingly pointed. The publisher needed the book. They had been waiting over a decade. Tolkien would respond with apologies and promises, but months would pass with little progress. The financial pressure was real. Tolkien wasn't a wealthy man. He was an Oxford professor with a modest salary and a family to support. But more than that, he needed to finish what he had started. The Lord of the Rings had become his life's work, the culmination of his private mythology. The story that contained everything he believed about heroism, sacrifice, language, and loss. The actual writing happened in stolen moments. Tolkien would work late into the night after his teaching duties, his desk covered in papers, his pipe smoldering in the ashtray. He wrote in pencil, his handwriting cramped and difficult to read. He would draft a chapter, then revise it again. Sometimes he would abandon entire sections and start over. His son Christopher watched his father struggle with the manuscript for years. The burden was visible. This wasn't writer's block. This was the terrifying responsibility of bringing a vast, intricate world to a close. But here's what most people don't realize. It wasn't just perfectionism. By 1949, Tolkien was having severe eye problems. His vision was deteriorating. He was prescribed medication for the pain that caused hallucinations and crippling anxiety. And during those dark moments, walking along the Seine, he was fighting something much deeper than a publishing deadline. By 1949, Tolkien had completed The Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers. But The Return of the King remained unfinished. The climax, the resolution, the fate of Frodo, Sam, Aragorn, and all of Middle-earth. Finally, in 1949, he wrote those two words he had been pursuing for over a decade. The end. But even then, he couldn't stop. He revised, he added the appendices, he rewrote sections. It would take until 1954 before the book was finally published, 17 years after he began. When The Return of the King was released in October of 1954, it was an immediate sensation. Critics praised it as a masterpiece. Readers devoured it. But the journey to that triumph had nearly broken Tolkien. He had carried the weight of his imagined world for nearly 2 decades. But what drove that obsession? What fire had forged this need to create a world so complete, so real, so heavy with meaning? On July 1st, 1916, 24-year-old Second Lieutenant J.R.R. Tolkien crouched in a trench on the Somme as British artillery opened fire on German positions. By the end of that single day, 20,000 British soldiers had fallen. Tolkien would survive, but he would carry the trenches with him forever and into The Return of the King. The Battle of the Somme was one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. Tolkien served as a signals officer, responsible for communication between units. He witnessed the industrial horror of modern warfare, the constant shelling, the mud, the bodies, the gas attacks, the senseless waste of young lives. He contracted trench fever and was sent back to England to recover. While he convalesced, news arrived that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His closest friends, the members of a group they called the TCBS, the Tea Club and Barovian Society, were falling. Geoffrey Smith fell in battle. Rob Gilson fell in battle. These weren't just friends, they were his fellowship, young men who shared his love of literature, language, and storytelling. They had believed they would change the world with their art. Instead, they perished in the mud of France. Tolkien rarely spoke directly about how the war influenced his writing. He explicitly rejected the idea that The Lord of the Rings was an allegory for World War I or World War II. In the foreword to the second edition, he wrote that he cordially disliked allegory in all its forms, and much preferred history with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. But applicability is not the same as denial. The war saturated his work in ways he may not have fully acknowledged, even to himself. Picture this: the gray marshes. Frodo and Sam are trudging through a swamp, and beneath the murky water they see faces, bodies, warriors from an ancient battle, perfectly preserved, their eyes open, their hands reaching up. It's one of the most haunting images in the book, and it came directly from the Somme, where shell craters filled with water and bodies remained visible beneath the surface. Tolkien saw this. He walked past it, and decades later he put it in his fantasy epic. The Pelennor Fields, where tens of thousands fall in a single devastating battle. The scale, the chaos, the industrial efficiency of the violence. That's World War I. The Mouth of Sauron, a diplomat so corrupted he's forgotten his own name, reflects the dehumanization Tolkien witnessed. Even the quest itself, two small figures trudging through a devastated landscape toward almost certain loss, mirrors the experience of soldiers in no man's land. But perhaps the most profound influence appears in Frodo. When Frodo returns to the Shire at the end of The Return of the King, he can't settle back into his old life. He's haunted, changed, wounded in ways that can't be healed. This isn't a typical fantasy ending where the hero returns home victorious and lives happily ever after. Frodo suffers from what we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. He can't enjoy the Shire he fought to save. Every year, on the anniversary of his wounding by the Nazgul, becomes ill. Tolkien understood this because he lived it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into how Tolkien's life shaped The Return of the King, Please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue creating content about the great books and the extraordinary people who wrote them. We talk about trauma differently now than we did in Tolkien's time. We have language for PTSD, for survivor's guilt, for wounds that never fully heal. But in 1916, soldiers were just expected to come home and get on with life. Stiff upper lip, don't complain. Tolkien didn't have therapy. He didn't have support groups. He didn't have the vocabulary we have now to describe what he was experiencing. What he had was his writing. And The Return of the King became his way of processing something he couldn't speak about directly. That's not just literary history. That's human survival. It's what people still do today when the pain is too deep for words. The friendship between Sam and Frodo reflects the bonds forged in the trenches, where soldiers developed a loyalty and love for one another that went beyond ordinary friendship. When Sam says, "I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you," it's one of the most powerful moments in the entire work, rooted in the kind of love that only shared suffering can create. Tolkien's experience of war also shaped his understanding of power and evil. Sauron isn't a sympathetic villain or a misunderstood antagonist. He's a force of domination, industrialization, and the will to power. The land around Mordor is stripped bare, polluted, turned into a factory for war. The orcs aren't born but made, corrupted and enslaved. This vision of evil as industrial and dehumanizing directly reflects what Tolkien saw in the mechanized violence of World War I. But the war wasn't the only force that shaped The Return of the King. Tolkien possessed another kind of genius, one that set him apart from every other fantasy writer before or since. Most authors invent characters. Tolkien invented entire languages first, and then created a world and a story where those languages could be spoken. The Return of the King wasn't just the conclusion of a fantasy epic. It was the culmination of a lifetime obsession with words, their sounds, and their power. J.R.R. Tolkien was a professional scholar of languages. His academic work focused on Old and Middle English, Gothic, Old Norse, and Welsh. But his private passion went far deeper. From his teenage years, Tolkien had been inventing his own languages, not simple codes or alphabets, but fully functional languages with grammar, syntax, vocabulary, and even different historical stages of development. He created Quenya, influenced by Finnish, as the ancient high language of the elves. He created Sindarin, influenced by Welsh, as the common elvish tongue. He created the black speech of Mordor, deliberately harsh and guttural. These weren't props or decorations. They were real, functioning languages that Tolkien could speak and write. This is what makes Middle-earth feel more real than any fantasy world created before or since. Listen to how this works. When you hear Elvish spoken, it sounds beautiful, flowing, musical, haunting. When you hear the black speech of Mordor, it sounds ugly, harsh, guttural, like something that shouldn't exist. That's not an accident. Tolkien spent years making sure Elvish sounded the way immortal, tragic beings would speak. The black speech had to sound like evil itself. Languages don't just mean something in Tolkien's world. They sound like what they represent. When Gandalf speaks in Quenya, when Aragorn is crowned and given his true name, Elessar, when the prophecy states that no living man can defeat the Witch King, and Éowyn reveals, "I am no man." These moments carry weight. The names themselves have meaning. Éowyn means horse joy in Old English. Aragorn contains the Sindarin word for king. Every name, every place, every title built on real linguistic principles. But Tolkien didn't stop at languages. He created entire histories to explain how those languages developed. He wrote the Silmarillion, a collection of myths and legends spanning thousands of years, primarily to provide a history for his invented tongues. He created calendars, genealogies tracing bloodlines back through generations. He drew detailed maps. He wrote poems and songs in his invented languages. Here's why this matters for the return of the king specifically. When Aragorn reclaims the throne of Gondor, we understand the weight of that moment because Tolkien has shown us the broken line of kings stretching back to Númenor. When Frodo reads the inscription on the One Ring in the Black Speech, we feel the horror because Tolkien has made language itself a carrier of evil. When Theoden passes on the Pelennor fields and his last words are in the language of his people, we mourn because Tolkien has made us believe in Rohan as a real culture. In Tolkien's mythology, language is tied to creation itself. The world was literally sung into being. Words have power. Names have meaning. This reflects Tolkien's Catholic faith and his belief in the creative power of language. The corruption of language by Sauron reflects the corruption of creation itself. Critics sometimes dismissed Tolkien's linguistic obsession as overly detailed or unnecessary. But it's precisely this depth that gives The Return of the King its lasting power. We don't just read about Middle-earth. We believe in it. The languages make it real. But languages and world-building alone don't make a great ending. The heart of The Return of the King lies in what Tolkien wanted to say about power, responsibility, and what it truly means to be a king. The hands of the king are the hands of a healer. With this prophecy, Tolkien revealed something radical. In The Return of the King, true nobility isn't proven through conquest, but through humility, service, and the courage to heal what is broken. Aragorn is the rightful heir to the throne of Gondor, descended from Isildur, who cut the ring from Sauron's hand 3,000 years earlier. But Aragorn has spent most of his life in hiding, wandering as a ranger in the wilderness. He calls himself Strider. He looks like a vagabond. He is underestimated and dismissed. And when he finally arrives in Minas Tirith during the siege, here's what he does. He doesn't march into the throne room and declare himself king. Instead, he goes to the houses of healing. Picture this scene. The city is in chaos. Thousands are wounded from the battle of the Pelennor fields, and Aragorn moves among them, using the herb Athelas, known in the common tongue as king's foil, to heal those injured in battle. His hands work quietly, gently. He speaks words of comfort. He tends to wounds. This act fulfills an ancient prophecy and proves his legitimacy. But more importantly, it reveals Tolkien's vision of kingship. In most fantasy stories, the hero proves himself through martial prowess, through defeating the villain in single combat, through strength and conquest. Tolkien deliberately subverts this. Aragorn is a skilled warrior, yes, but that's not what makes him worthy of the crown. What makes him worthy is his humility, his willingness to serve, his patience, and his commitment to healing rather than dominating. Think about our current moment. We're obsessed with power. Who has it? Who deserves it? Who abuses it? We debate what makes a good leader constantly. Tolkien wrote The Return of the King when the world was recovering from two catastrophic wars caused by people who believed might makes right. His answer? True leadership isn't about domination. It's about service. It's about healing. In 2026, when we're constantly arguing about what legitimate authority looks like, when we're watching leaders choose between self-interest and public good, Tolkien's vision feels more relevant than ever. Aragorn understands that leadership is stewardship. So does Faramir, who explicitly states that he wouldn't take the ring even if it lay on the highway, because he doesn't wish to dominate others. Contrast this with Denethor, the steward of Gondor, who has been corrupted by pride and despair. Denethor believes power belongs to him by right. He uses a palantir to spy and gains knowledge, but that knowledge destroys him because he lacks wisdom and humility. He ends his own life rather than submit to anyone else's authority. And then there's Sauron himself, the ultimate expression of the will to power. Sauron seeks total domination. The ring is the physical manifestation of this impulse. It corrupts everyone who touches it, because it represents the temptation to force your will upon others. Boromir falls to it. Saruman falls to it. Even Galadriel and Gandalf refuse to touch it, because they know what it would do to them. The only way to defeat Sauron is to destroy the ring, to reject the temptation of power entirely. But here's where Tolkien makes a brilliant and devastating choice. The ring isn't destroyed through heroic will. At the cracks of doom, after everything, after carrying the ring all the way to Mount Doom, Frodo looks at it one last time and says, "The ring is mine." He puts it on. The hero fails. The quest ends in failure. And that's when something unexpected happens. Gollum attacks, bites off his finger, and falls into the fire with the ring. The victory comes not through strength, but through grace. Through an accident Frodo didn't plan or control. Salvation comes not through human power, but through grace. And this brings us to Sam, who might be the true king of the Return of the King. Sam is a gardener. He has no royal blood, no special destiny, no legendary sword. What he has is loyalty, love, and the willingness to keep going even when all hope is gone. Picture this moment. Frodo can't walk anymore. The ring is too heavy. They're partway up Mount Doom and Frodo collapses. Sam looks at his friend and says 6 words that define real heroism. "I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you." And he lifts Frodo onto his back and climbs a volcano. In Tolkien's moral universe, this is heroism, not conquest, not glory, but faithfulness, service, and the courage to do good in small ways. If you found this exploration of Tolkien's themes meaningful, please share this video with someone who loves The Return of the King. And let us know in the comments what you think true heroism looks like. There's one more element of The Return of the King that often surprises readers: the scouring of the Shire. After the ring is destroyed, after Aragorn is crowned, the hobbits return home, only to find the Shire occupied and corrupted. Saruman has taken over. Trees have been cut down. The hobbits have been enslaved. And so Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin must fight one final battle, not in some distant land, but in their own home. This chapter is sometimes criticized as anticlimactic, but it's essential to Tolkien's vision. The Return of the King isn't just about Aragorn returning to his throne. It's about everyone returning to their place in the world and accepting the responsibility that comes with it. The hobbits have been changed by their journey. They can't simply go back to the way things were. They must use what they've learned to heal and defend their home. The Lord of the Rings doesn't end with a coronation or a feast. It ends with Frodo sailing away from Middle-earth forever, leaving Sam behind on the shore. Tolkien knew that some wounds can't be healed in this world, and he had the courage to write that truth. The Grey Havens. Picture this. The last ships of the elves are preparing to sail into the west, leaving Middle-earth forever. Gandalf is there, Galadriel and Elrond, Bilbo, ancient and frail, and Frodo. Frodo, who carried the ring to its destruction, who saved Middle-earth, who is supposed to be the hero, can't stay. His wound from the Morgul blade never fully healed. Every year on the anniversary, he becomes ill. He can't write. He can't rest. The Shire he fought to save brings him no peace, and so he must leave. He boards the ship and sails into the west, to the undying lands, to a place where perhaps he can finally heal. Sam stands on the shore, watching the ship disappear. He's just said goodbye to Frodo, possibly forever. The moment is devastating. It's not a triumphant ending. It's not a simple happy ending. It's real, it's painful, and it's absolutely perfect. Tolkien knew this pain intimately. He never fully returned from the trenches of World War I. Like Frodo, he carried wounds that wouldn't heal. He had nightmares. He struggled with survivor's guilt. Why did he live when so many of his friends perished? Frodo's inability to remain in the Shire reflects Tolkien's own experience. Some traumas are too deep. Some burdens leave permanent marks. But the ending isn't entirely bleak. This is where the unexpected grace that pierces through sorrow becomes central. It doesn't erase the sorrow. It doesn't undo the loss. But it provides a glimpse of hope, of joy, of meaning beyond the suffering. Frodo sails away, yes, but he sails toward healing. Sam loses his dearest friend, yes, but he returns to the Shire and opens the door to his family. His wife Rose is there, his daughter Eleanor, and Sam says simply, "Well, I'm back." Those 3 words are some of the most powerful in all of literature. Well, I'm back. Sam has been to the end of the world and back. He's seen wonders and horrors. He's lost Frodo, but he returns to his life, to his home, to the people he loves. He accepts the bittersweet reality. He chooses to keep living, to keep serving, to keep going. Maybe you've stood on that shore. Maybe you've watched something sail away that you couldn't get back. A person, a dream, a version of yourself. Maybe you've had to open a door and say, "I'm back," when you weren't sure you could. Tolkien understood that feeling. He lived it. He survived the trenches when his friends didn't. He struggled for 17 years to finish a book that nearly broke him. He poured his war trauma, his faith, his linguistic genius, and his deepest beliefs into every page. And in The Return of the King, he gave us an ending worthy of that immense effort. Sam stands on that beach, watching the ship disappear into the west. Frodo is gone. The ring is destroyed. Middle-earth is saved. And Sam turns around and walks home. He opens the door. His wife is there, his daughter, his life. And he says 3 words that might be the most important in all of literature. Well, I'm back. Not I won, not it's over, not I'm a hero, just I'm back. That's the gift Tolkien gave us after 17 years of struggle, after surviving the trenches, after nearly going blind, after walking along the Seine, contemplating violence against his own creation. He gave us an ending that tells the truth. Some wounds never heal. Some friends leave and don't come back. Some victories cost everything. But you still have to open the door and say, "I'm back." You still have to keep living. 70 years later, The Return of the King is still breaking our hearts and putting them back together at the same time. Because it's not really about hobbits or rings or dark lords. It's about you. It's about me. It's about every person who has ever had to finish something they thought would break them. Who has ever lost someone they couldn't get back. Who has ever stood on a shore watching something sail away and then turned around and chose to keep going anyway. Tolkien knew that some stories don't end with victory parades. They end with a gardener opening a door and choosing one more time to live. And maybe that's the most heroic thing anyone can do. If this resonated with you, If you've ever stood on that shore, subscribe to this channel. We're building something here, a community of people who believe stories matter, that books can change lives, that the struggle to create something meaningful is worth it. Hit subscribe. Tell us in the comments about a time you had to say, "I'm back," when you didn't know if you could. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because Tolkien's words deserve to live, and so do yours. Thanks for being here.